All right. Good to see you here this morning. I missed being here last week, but I was in Singapore and worshiping with Joe. It was good to see him. Uh, Today, we're going to look at Ecclesiastes chapter 10. And just a word of forewarning. Next week, we're going to be looking at Ecclesiastes chapter 12. And then the following week, chapter 11. Our speaker next Sunday had a conflict arise, and so he asked me to trade with him. And so we'll be doing 12 next Sunday and then 11 the following Sunday as we finish up the book of Ecclesiastes. So today we're going to look at chapter 10. And the title of the message is Dead Flies in the Drugstore and Little Birds in the Bedroom. And so hopefully that maybe piqued your interest as to what we're talking about, dead flies and little birds, and or else the consequences of foolishness. However, before we look at the first few verses of our passage today, again, I think it's helpful to orient ourselves as to where we are in the book of Ecclesiastes. Oh. Oh, is it not on? No, it's not on. Tell me this thing. Let's try again. Good. We've looked at the first half of Ecclesiastes, where the first 6 chapters are about critiquing vanity in this world. There are a lot of passages in there that says vanity, vanity, all is vanity or meaningless. There's nowhere you can put your hope in this world that's going to satisfy you. That will give you what you want for joy and life in this world. So don't search for it, because there's nothing to be found under the sun. Then in the second half, in chapter 7 and following, the preacher's trying to give us a positive view for how to live in this world. In chapter 7, chapter 8, and then chapter 9, the preacher has been commending to us wisdom and encouraging us to seek after wisdom. This becomes particularly apparent in the last 3 verses of chapter 9, which you studied last week, where 3 times the preacher says that wisdom is better in verse 16, and then in verse 17, and the words of the wise are better. And then in verse 18 again, wisdom is better than weapons of war. And then in verse 18, he shifts gears and he says, but one sinner destroys much good. He's been focusing positively on wisdom, urging us towards wisdom. But now he gives the flip side and gives us a warning and says, but understand, it takes just a little bit of folly, a little bit of foolishness, a little slip of the tongue, and you can sink the ship. So today, we're going to look at 3 pieces of advice Solomon gives concerning wisdom and avoiding folly. In chapter 10, verses 1 through 10, he urges us to exemplify wisdom in all of our actions by avoiding foolishness, evaluating leaders, and accepting the consequences of our actions. He then advises us to embrace the power of words by recognizing the value of effective communication and examining the dangers of using words foolishly. Finally, he admonishes us to endure the challenges that come our way in life by employing prudence and exercising discretion in the course of living our lives. So let's look first at the idea of exemplifying wisdom in every action. Look at verses 1 through 10. Dead flies make the perfumer's ointment give off a stench. So a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. A wise man's heart inclines him to the right, but a fool's heart to the left. Even when the fool walks on the road, he lacks sense, and he says to everyone that he is a fool. If the anger of the ruler rises against you, Do not leave your place, for calmness will lay great offenses to rest. There is an evil that I have seen under the sun, as it were on error proceeding from the ruler. Continuing on, folly is set in many high places, and the rich sit in a low place. I have seen slaves on horses and princes walking on the ground like slaves. He who digs a pit will fall into it, and a serpent will bite him who breaks through a wall. He who quarries stones is hurt by them, and he who splits logs is endangered by them. If the iron is blunt and one does not sharpen the edge, he must use more strength. But wisdom helps one to succeed. So first, we're told to eliminate foolishness. Solomon reminds us of the destructive nature of folly. Just as a dead fly ruins precious ointment, even a small amount of foolishness can undermine our wisdom and honor. The opening statement here is an illustration that would have been immediately understood by the writer's readers, where in one verse it says, as dead flies give perfume or ointment a bad smell, so a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. Ointment was made by an apothecary or a chemist or a perfumer. He usually created the ointment by skillfully mixing precious spices, scents, herbs, or medical extracts into an olive oil base. The fragrance from these additions to the oil naturally attracted flies. These unwitting flies then become entrapped in the miry, oily substance. Not only did the flies corrupt the ointment by their simple presence, but their decaying bodies caused the ointment to spoil and stink. Flies are quite commonly used as a symbol of decay, of corruption, and of ruin. We've all seen flies drawn to dead animals and spoil the fruit. So in the process, there's that other verses, I got them confused. So in the process of making perfume, it would only take one small fly. And although it is a tiny creature, it could spoil the whole fragrance very easily, causing it to give off a stench. And he said, in the same way, it doesn't take much folly to outweigh wisdom and honor. A fly in the ointment is a picture of, or is a picture, an image of sin in the life of a believer. I imagine the apothecary represents God. The ointment and spices represent our lives, our actions, how we live. And the sweet smelling aroma or fragrance is the testimony produced in our lives. In 2 Corinthians 2:15, our life and testimony are similarly described as an aroma. But in that aroma can be spoiled by the flies, by the sin in our life. You could build a reputation in your life for many years, a period of 20 or even 30 years. You could be known for being a wise and honorable citizen. And then in a moment of foolishness, you can mar that reputation. A tiny amount of folly may destroy a family, ruin a reputation, bring heartache into a marriage, or as Benjamin Franklin observed, it takes many good deeds to build a good reputation, and only one bad one to lose it. How true that is. What he is saying in the opening verses of chapter 10 is simply an extension of the way in which he concluded chapter 9. Wisdom is better than the weapons of war. One sinner destroys much good. It takes far less to ruin something than it does to create it. In a foolish impulse, in a sudden lapse of judgment, something beautiful may be irreparably spoiled. Therefore, you have to set your moral guard. The same is true regarding any fall into sin. Watch out for the unguarded moment, the damage caused by a hasty word, by irritable temper, by rudeness of manner, by the occasional slip, by the supposedly harmless eccentricity. Verse 2 points out that when we err in this way, it is ultimately an issue of the heart. For those of you who are left-handed, don't allow this verse to unsettle you. In the Living Translation, it says, a wise person chooses the right road, a fool takes the wrong one. And that's the point he's making. The folly here is not primarily that of mental deficiency, but of moral deficiency. The fool inclines to what is wrong, to the extent, as he then points out in verse 3, that this kind of foolishness isn't easily disguised. And he provides us with a comic picture, the kind of fool that you find portrayed constantly in Shakespeare's plays. Even when the fool walks along the road, his sense is lacking, and he demonstrates to everyone that he is a fool. There's something about the way a fool walks, the way a fool expresses himself. It is absolute foolishness to see these drunken people come down the street. They think it's so terrific, but they look foolish. When you cross-reference this with what it says in the book of Proverbs, you will discover that when the fool is approaching, you'll be able to sense it because other people are leaving. As the fool approaches, people leave. That's what he says in Proverbs 14:7. Why is everybody backing off? Because they can see him coming. The fool seldom listens to what he's being told. He says, and looks all around, but he doesn't actually pay attention. And those around him in turn do not pay attention to him as well. We must strive to eliminate foolishness from our lives. In our lives, we can try to clean up what comes out of our lives, our actions, but the actions will only become clean when the source of the contamination, when the heart is cleaned up. There's always an emptying before new life can replace the old. A good cleansing or confession must first take place. So not only do we need to eliminate foolishness in our lives, we need to evaluate foolish actions. So there's this advice concerning the necessity of removing foolishness from our lives. And then in verses 5-7, we also have a sort of general example of the danger of folly in the world. In verses 5-7, there's an evil that I've seen under the sun, as it were an error proceeding from the ruler. Folly is set in many high places, and the rich sit in a low place. I have seen slaves on horses and princes walking on the ground like slaves. Now, the point of this is not that folly can elevate people, so therefore it's a good thing. The preacher, as well as the rest of the Bible, especially in wisdom literature, talk often about how wisdom is what rightfully raises the lowly to higher places of honor. So what he's saying here is that foolishness turns the world upside down. It inverts what is right. It reverses what is just. When foolishness turns the world upside down, it puts the wrong people in the wrong positions of leadership at the wrong time. The crisis of foolishness turns the world upside down. The preacher is saying this because he wants you to take stock of your life, to take stock of your wisdom and your foolishness. What we see here is that it only takes just a little bit of foolishness to outweigh a lifetime, even of wisdom and honor. A recent tragic example illustrates this point, that it takes just a little bit of folly to outweigh wisdom and honor. Recently on a movie production set, a famous actor was given a gun that he apparently thought did not have live ammunition. In the process, the gun discharged and a woman was killed, and a man standing behind her was also wounded. There you have the smallest of errors, a blank that looks exactly like a bullet. The only difference is a small, tiny little piece of projectile that's included in one and not the other. They look nearly identical. Here you have the smallest bit of folly, and it causes the most horrifying consequences. Think about how many Hollywood movies have been made where they safely used guns in the making of a movie or a TV show. And yet here you have someone who died from this, the smallest possible error, but the greatest possible price. That's what the preacher wants to get into our heads. It's not just, I'm sure it'll be fine, no big deal, what's the harm? No, the preacher's saying folly can ruin your life like that. And it just takes a little. Solomon warns us to be discerning, even in the smallest of our actions. Not all in authority make wise decisions, and sometimes errors or mistakes occur. As believers, we should not only pray for wisdom in our own actions, but also pray for leaders who seek God's guidance and make righteous choices in their actions. Are you taking stock of this in your own life? Folly is the fly in the ointment. Even a little foolishness can destroy much good. Foolishness is never leading toward the good, but always leads away from it. Now, there's so much at stake in our society because foolishness inverts and turns the world upside down. The next thing the preacher is going to tell us is that there's also much at stake for the fool himself. It's not just that he's a danger to those around him, even though he is, but the fool is also a danger to himself. And so embracing the consequences. Life is filled with cause and effect. We should wisely embrace the consequences of our actions and as a result, choose wisely. Look at verse 8, where we're given a warning. He who digs a pit will fall into it, and a serpent will bite him who breaks through a wall. So when it talks about first those who dig a pit fall into it, which seems parallel to Psalm chapter 7, which talks explicitly about this kind of situation. And it's absolutely clear that it is a sinister, malicious situation. Psalms 7, 14 through 16 says, behold, the wicked man conceives evil and is pregnant with mischief and gives birth to lies. He makes a pit, digging it out, and falls into the hole that he has made. His mischief returns upon his own head, and on his own skill his violence descends. When I think about this, what I think this is talking about here is a man who digs a pit, not just as a normal part of digging a ditch, but somehow who is trying to catch someone. And you're reading about his mischief falling on his own head. In verse 8, the preacher is saying the fool is absolutely a danger to himself by the wickedness and mischief that he's trying to use against others. That will come back upon its own head, which is what Psalm 7 says. You suffer a lot of risk from the things that you do, even if you're not being a fool. In chapter 9, the preacher talked a lot about this, saying there's no way to manipulate God. There's no way to coerce God to give you what you want. You cannot offer the right sacrifice to the right God at the right time to get from him exactly what you want from him. The preacher is holding both of these 2 points together in verse 9. Then in verse 10, the preacher continues and gives us another risk that the fool poses to himself. If the iron is blunt and one does not sharpen the edge, he must use more strength. But wisdom helps one succeed. We are maybe talking still about the log splitting of verse 9, but the point is very clear that if you have a blunt iron, if you have a blunt axe, you're just not going to get very far, very fast. Wisdom makes your life and your work easier, less exerting, less taxing. But the fool wears himself out with the fact that he won't adopt a life characterized by wisdom. Solomon next turns his attention to the need to embrace the power of words. Beginning in verse 11, he says, if the serpent bites before it is charmed, there is no advantage to the charmer. The words of a wise man's mouth win him favor, but the lips of a fool consume him. The beginning of the words of his mouth is foolishness, and the end of his talk is evil madness. A fool multiplies words, though no one knows what is to be. And who can tell him what will be after him? The toil of a fool wearies him, for he does not know the way to the city. So we see here the necessity of effective communication. Just as a snake's bite can interrupt the charmer's work, ill-timed or inappropriate words can harm our relationships and endeavors. We should always choose our words carefully. Verse 11 comes back to this serpent or snake imagery again. If a serpent bites before it is charmed, there is no advantage to the charmer. Now, the way the ESV has this, it sounds like the same word is used twice, charmed and then the charmer. But actually, the first use in verse 11 talks about charmed, if the serpent bites before it's charmed. Then it's slightly different than at the end of the verse, where it literally said, there is no advantage to the master of the tongue. Instead of charmed, it's the master of the tongue. What the preacher is saying is that you can't talk your way out of every situation. I remember when I was a teacher, there were many times students would come and they would try to talk themselves out of any sort of situation that maybe they had forgotten to do their homework or they had forgotten to turn in an assignment. I'm sure none of you have ever done that. But anyway, I remember it happening. So what the preacher is saying is that you can't talk your way out of it. The fool is the one who is always trying to use his words to sway people around him, just like a charmer with charming a snake. But if you don't charm that snake fast enough, you could get bitten. And sometimes your words will not be able to talk you out of the situation that you are in. Indeed, the preacher is going on in verse 12 to talk about the fool's words. Verse 12, the words of a wise man's mouth win him favor, but the lips of a fool consume him. It's not just that he might not be able to work fast enough. What he's saying is actually consuming or destroying him. Solomon then tells us to examine the cost of foolish words. Solomon continues in verses 13 through 15, teaching us how we must assess the consequences of those who talk endlessly and foolishly, and yet do not even know their way to the city. Verse 13 asks why. The beginning of his word is the word of his mouth is foolishness. At the end of his talk is evil madness. The fool isn't giving something wise, something substantive. He's giving something that begins in foolishness and ends in evil madness. Verse 14 says, a fool multiplies words, though no man knows what is to be, and who can tell what will be after him. The wise, on the other hand, understands that he doesn't know what is to come, whereas the fool is always constantly speaking, multiplying his words, pretending that he knows exactly what is to come. The summary of all this and the danger that a fool poses to himself is in verse 15. The toil of a fool wearies him. It makes him tired, for he does not know the way to the city. The fool is often confused about what is happening, and he's the absolute danger to himself. That's a hard way to live. Have you ever known people that just talk foolishly on and on and on and on? I've met a few of those in my life. Think about the frustration that you experience when you take a wrong turn, or when you miss an exit, or when you pick the slowest moving line at the supermarket. I always do this. I always choose a line that I think is going to be good, and it ends up taking the longest amount of time. I know how frustrating this can be. I'm sure I'm not alone in this situation. So, what does it cost you? It costs you a little time, a little inconvenience, a little frustration. But what about the circumstances where foolishness can destroy your life? Now, there's a place for urging people not to be fools to protect those around him. But as the preacher shows us here, you also need to be self-interested. If you are a fool, you're consuming your own life. Your life is at risk from your own foolishness. In light of what it can cost you, what your foolishness can cost you, isn't the hard work of wisdom worth it? Not only are we to exemplify wisdom in our actions and to embrace the power of words, Solomon finally also instructs us to endure life's challenges. Solomon concludes the chapter by highlighting the happiness that comes from wise and responsible leadership. In our own lives, we should strive to find contentment and happiness, even in the face of life's uncertainties, trusting in God's plan. Look at verses 16 through 20. Woe to you, O land, when your child is a king and your princes feast in the morning. Happy are you, O land, when your king is the son of the nobility and your princes feast at the proper time for strength and not for drunkenness. Though through sloth or the roof sinks in and through indolence, the house leaks. Bread is made for laughter, wine gladdens life, and money answers everything. Even in your thoughts, do not curse the king, nor in your bedroom curse the rich. For a bird of the air, there's the bird in the bedroom, will carry your voice, or some winged creature tell the matter. So we have the idea of employing the prudence in leadership. Immature leadership can lead to a land's downfall. Leaders must demonstrate wisdom and maturity in their decisions rather than indulging in self-gratification. As believers, we should pray for leaders who prioritize the welfare of their people. So while folly is always destructive, especially for the fool himself, the preacher goes on in this final section to make one last important point, namely that foolishness in leadership is especially destructive and damaging to a nation. Here we see the catastrophe of a foolish king. In verse 16, the preacher says, "Woe to you, O land, when your king is a child and your princes feast in the morning." Michael Eaton, the Bible commentator, makes a really important point. He reminds us to remember that the preacher, the speaker here, is Solomon. While he never names himself, I believe Solomon is writing this. And you may remember in 1 Kings 3, when Solomon has just become the king, and God comes to him a dream in the night and says, "Solomon, what do you want? Ask me anything, I'll give it to you." And Solomon doesn't ask for long days of life. He doesn't ask for riches. He doesn't ask for victory over his enemies. Instead, he asks for wisdom. And what he says is, "I am a child. I'm not able to govern over these people." And in this passage, the preacher says, "Woe to you, land, when your king is a child." He's not talking about someone who is young, numerically speaking, or age-wise. He's talking about someone who has no maturity, no wisdom that he's governing by. And more than that, his lack of wisdom leads to dissipation and debauchery among his princes and princes. Feasting in the morning. Rather than being out and productively spending those daylight hours, these princes are partying. The contrast to this is in verse 17. "Happy are you, O land, when your king is the son of the nobility and your princes feast at the proper time for strength and not for drunkenness." Now, there's a question about how to understand verse 18 and 19. Namely, are these just random new general principles of wisdom, or is the preacher continuing to talk about the king now? I believe even though the general principles are true as well, but I think he's still talking about the king because in verse 20, he still has the king on his mind. And so in verses 18 and 19, he says, first of all, in verse 18, "Through sloth, the roof sinks in, and through indolence, the house leaks." Now, this is true for all of us. If we're lazy, or if we do not properly maintain them, our houses will leak. However, remember that the word of the house, the word for house is another word for kingdom. When God swears to establish an everlasting kingdom with David in Samuel 7:16, 2 Samuel, he says, "Your house and your kingdom will never depart from me." What is David's house? It is his kingdom. So we're talking here about the house, not just the home you live in, but the household, the kingdom itself. Through sloth or laziness, that roof is going to sink in, and through indolence, that kingdom will sink. And leaky wisdom sinks a kingdom. And what about verse 19? "Bread is made for laughter, wine gladdens life, and money answers everything." Here the preacher is talking about the good gifts of God and the proper use of the good gifts of God. Remember bread and wine, that takes us back to the feasting in verses 16 and 17. Are you using those gifts wisely? Are you feasting at the proper time for strength and not for wickedness? Or are you misusing those gifts, abusing those gifts to use them so that your princes are feasting in the morning? Let me clarify something here. The preacher's statement that money answers everything is a simple practical observation that wealth is a tool that can meet the need for food, clothing, shelter, and so on. We should not take his words as endorsing the idea that absolutely every issue one can think of can be solved by money, because that's not what he's saying. God has given us, though, good gifts that we should enjoy, and we should use them for the proper purposes. If we misuse them, then that's a problem, not only for the king, but even for us. If the king is the one doing it, it's still a problem for us. Even so, even if you live in the realm of a childish king, like the one described in verse 16, the preacher says, be careful, even in your thoughts. We need to exercise discretion. Verse 27 says, even in your thoughts, do not curse the king, nor in your bedroom curse the rich, or a bird of the air will carry your voice, or some winged creature tell the matter. Solomon reminds us to exercise discretion in our thoughts and words, even in private. We should refrain from cursing or speaking ill of those in authority or the wealthy. Our words and thoughts have a way of reaching others, and we should cultivate a spirit of respect. In verse 20, even in your thoughts do not curse the king, nor in your bedroom curse the rich, for a bird of the air will carry your voice, or some winged creature tell the matter. Perhaps you've heard the phrase, a little bird told me, when inquiring how someone knew something that you did not think anyone else knew. Therefore, it's imperative that we watch what we say, even in private, as sometimes our words have a way of coming back to haunt us. However, the point of all this is that the more authority you've been entrusted over others, the further the consequences of your wisdom and your foolishness will stretch. If the king is wise, all of the people are blessed. If the king is a fool, that foolishness will curse the entire realm. So the question that the preacher is asking us about your authority, the authority that you wield, whether it's a small amount or a large amount, is, are you like Solomon, acknowledging that you are a child on your own and that you need God's wisdom to teach you? Are you spending your time productively? How do you spend your time? Do you waste a lot of time playing games or just doing nothing, sitting around? Are you using your time productively? Are you burning your daylight hours well to build up your house? Are you delaying gratification and leisure and entertainment and feasting to the proper and wise time and the proper and wise purposes? You know, we live in a generation of instant gratification. We want things now. You know, you go to McDonald's, if you have to wait more than 2 or 3 minutes, we get very upset. We want things now. Everything we want. Many young couples, they get married and they think that they need to have everything that their parents took 20 or 30 years to get. Your parents worked 20, 30 years to get something. And a lot of young people, they decide, they get married. Oh, I need to have 2 cars. I need to have a house. I need to have flat screen TV. I need to have all of these things that my parents worked years to get. And so what do? They use plastic money. They use credit cards. They get themselves in debt. And then they get themselves in real trouble. So we need to be careful that we use things, the resources that we have, we need to use them wisely. Also, in all of this, towards those who are in authority over you, are you blessing them with your words or are you cursing? You know, the word of the king is still supreme. A little bird will still carry your voice to him, which will get you in trouble. So we need to be, yes, you may not like all the leaders of your country or another country, but we still need to be praying for them. That is our responsibility as Christians, to be praying for them. So be careful how you live. As I said recently, you will be the only Bible that some people will ever read. There is a story of a king and his clown or his jester, who sometimes said very foolish things. One day the jester had said something so foolish that the king, handing him a staff, said to him, "Take this and keep it till you find a bigger fool than yourself." Some years later, the king lay on his deathbed. His couriers were called. His family and his servants also stood round his bedside. The king, addressing them, said, I am about to leave you. I am going on a very long journey, and I shall not return again to this place. So I've called you all to say goodbye. Then his jester stepped forward and, addressing the king, said, Your Majesty, may I ask a question? When you have journeyed abroad, visiting your people or paying diplomatic visits to other courts, your heralds and servants have always gone before you, making preparation for you. May I ask what preparation your Majesty has made for this long journey that he is about to take? Alas, replied the king, I have made no preparations. Then said the jester, Take this staff with you, for now I have found a bigger fool than myself. Friends, like the king, each of us will sometime set out on our final journey. Have you made preparation for that journey? Or have you, like the king, neglected the most important preparation that anyone should make? None of us, no matter what our age, has any guarantee of tomorrow or when that final journey will begin for us. So I would encourage you today, even plead with you to make preparation so that when death comes knocking on your door, you will have made preparation for the journey. Ecclesiastes 10 offers us timeless wisdom, encouraging us to exemplify wisdom in every action, to embrace the power of our words, and to endure life's uncertainties with faith. These lessons should inspire us to walk daily with God's guidance, to make wise choices, and to speak words that bring life and blessing. As we apply these principles to our daily lives, we can live in a way that honors the Lord and influences the world for his glory. Let's pray. Father, I just pray that we would live lives characterized by wisdom and that we would be a light in the world. And I pray if there's anyone here today that has not made preparation for that final journey, whenever it comes, I pray that even today they might make preparation for that final journey. In Jesus' name I pray.